Hello, this is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about atheists on the internet, or militant atheists. One of the problems, of course, with talking about this topic is its relevancy in the modern world. The new atheism was a tour de force in the early 2000s, after September 11th, 2001, but quite contrary to how people often imagine it. It was not really a new movement. Nothing in it was new. Even the one thing people say was new about it, the absolute contempt that the atheists held for religion and religious people, was actually old. Indeed, if you look at works from the 19th century, you'll see exactly the same arguments and exactly the same contempt for religious people. Or at least their equivalent of it. Because in the 19th century, the atheists who were developing humanism often understood humanism as a religion. In fact, while today secular humanists prefer to say that their beliefs are a non-religious life stance, the truth of the matter is, secular humanism is a religion, and only can be claimed to not be a religion if you selectively define religion so that it requires belief in a god of some sort. And we all know atheists today prefer to equate religion and theism, so that atheism is the opposite of religion. So a secular humanist who is by definition an atheist is not religious because they don't believe in a god. But at the same time, even the way they talk about religion reveals that they don't really think of religion as simply believing in a god, or even believing a god exists and worshipping said god. They'll even contradict the notion that you need a god to be a religion. For example, communism is often cited as a reason to be wary of atheist movements, and the atheist community often not only claimed that they had nothing to do with communism, and it's wrong to equate atheism to communism, but they also claimed communism was a form of religion. The divine prophet Sam Harris, most holy, even said that not only should we remove the atrocities committed by communists from the atheist ledger, but we should actually place the atrocities committed by the communists in the religion ledger, proving even more atrocities committed in the name of religion. But of course, the divine prophet Sam Harris, most holy, seems not to be too consistent with that mentality, because he, in turn, in all of his books, tends to treat religion as belief in gods and belief in the supernatural. And that's sort of the main issue I have with the modern-day atheist movement. It claims to be an intellectual movement that is trying to teach science and skepticism and critical thinking. In reality, it is an anti-intellectual movement that teaches you how to use childish insults. Although it doesn't teach you how to come up with childish insults, it simply gives you a list of childish insults, and most of the time they are simply repeated verbatim. And it teaches you how to come up with excuses to reject Christianity specifically, not even religion in general, just Christianity. Indeed, it just gives you a list of excuses. And ultimately, the atheist movement has a very shallow view of what religion is, or even what Christianity is, which, of course, is something that they never admit to, because they're too busy telling us that they used to be devout Christians. There are exceptions to this, like Kemet Mehta, the self-declared friendly atheist who makes a lot of money telling people to hate Christians. And always write an article about either Christianity in general, or specific Christian organizations, or specific Christian individuals, and how they're awful, especially if they're being praised as heroes. He'll expose the truth of how evil they really are, like he did with Chris Avail, someone who was housing homeless in his church, and who was attacked by the city. According to Meta, he deserved it because he didn't even run a church, but an arcade, and it was a death trap, and all the zoning laws, and since he had made a deal with a Christian law firm, it's obvious that he didn't really care about the homeless, and it was a publicity stunt for money, which is hypocritical from Hamet Meta, the self-declared friendly atheist, since he is on the board of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, an anti-Christian hate group that uses lawfare in order to attack Christians constantly. Of course, officially it's simply a activist group trying to preserve everyone's freedom by promoting secularism, which is good for non-religious people and religious people alike, protecting everyone's rights and freedoms. They simply stand for the First Amendment, separation of religion and state, and preserving everyone's rights. They're not a hate group. But all one has to do is go to their website and read the articles or go to their store. What sort of organization only exists to stand up for American principles of separation of religion and state and secularism and freedom for all, who isn't a hate group that's anti-Christian, would then sell Bible warning stickers telling us that literal belief in this book is hazardous to your health, or sell what they call non-tracts, which, rather like deconversion, is supposed to be the opposite of a tract, just as deconversion is the opposite of conversion. But if you were to look at a non-tract, it looks exactly the same as a tract. What makes it the opposite of a tract, what makes it a non-tract, is that it's made by atheists and is not promoting religion but anti-religion. Just like when you become religious, you convert, but when you become an atheist and leave religion, you deconvert. Atheists, of course, try very hard to reinforce the idea that they're the opposite of religion, and yet they do exactly the same things religion does these days. A non-tract is, of course, just a tract that they're calling a non-tract, so that they can pretend it's not the same thing when it really is. It's a folded piece of paper telling you a message that is trying to convince you of their point of view. Just because it is released by atheists does not mean it is not a tract. And just calling it a non-tract doesn't mean it's not really a tract. Just as when people deconvert from religion, they're actually just converting to atheism. Even if I were to accept that atheists are not religious, as they wish me to convert does not mean to become religious. To convert means to change. So when they talk about deconverting, because you convert to religion and you deconvert from religion when you become an atheist, they're really just talking nonsense. Now, I know real institutions use the word deconvert, and that proves it's a real word. I was even made fun of for calling the word deconvert and deconversion a silly made-up nonsense word. I was wrong. Real institutions use the word, and that makes it valid. But do keep in mind, real institutions use the word atheist. Real institutions use the word atheism. And yet, the divine prophet Sam Harris, Most Holy, as well as the divine prophet Richard Dawkins, Most Holy, and several of their acolytes, have said that the word atheism should not exist, since it describes a non-belief, and we don't have any other word for not believing in something. We don't call people who don't believe in unicorns a-unicornists. Of course, they're atheists being critical of a word, you see. When an atheist says the word atheist shouldn't exist, what they're saying is profound and wise and obviously has merit. Even if you disagree, it is not a stupid thing to say. They have a point. Atheism is a mere lack of belief in a God, and we don't have words for a lack of belief in other things. But if I, a religious person, were to dare question one of these words, if I, as a religious person, dare says deconversion is a silly made-up nonsense word, I'm very obviously wrong. Real institutions use the word, and I deserve to be mocked and ridiculed. Of course, it doesn't change the fact that the only reason this perfectly valid, perfectly real word that real institutions use even exists is so that atheists can pretend to be the opposite of religion by and pretend the process of becoming an atheist is the opposite of becoming religious. You convert to religion, you deconvert from religion to atheism. It's a rather obvious that even though I was wrong because real institutions use the word deconversion only exists to reinforce the idea that atheists are not religious. And they need to reinforce the fact that atheists are not religious because every single atheist organization that exists, which, by the way, all of them are 501c3 tax-exempt organizations, and many of them, like the American Humanist Association, are also 501c1. It's kind of one of those dirty secrets that the atheist community doesn't talk about much while they're talking about taxing the church and the Johnson Amendment and how religious organizations break the law by getting involved in politics and should be stripped of their tax exemption, and how if we only tax the church its fair share we can solve all of social problems. Oh, it's so unfair that religion gets tax exemption. As well as, of course, the other point, proving that atheism is not a religion. They can mic drop you. They can tell you, if atheism is a religion, does that mean atheists can get tax breaks like religion? Ooh, mic drop! After all, religion doesn't pay taxes. Atheists have to pay taxes, but religion doesn't. Ooh, mic drop! Except all the atheists saying that are listening to atheists who work for organizations that are tax exempt. Organizations which, by the way, get involved in politics. Every single atheist organization promotes political agendas. American Atheists, for instance, rather famously promotes the Democrat Party in America. It supports Democrat candidates, even if they are problematic because they are religious. The American Atheists hate the Republican Party. American Atheists really hate Donald Trump. Now keep in mind, on this channel I'm not trying to tell you who to vote for. I'm not really that political. But at the same time, it's impossible to ignore, if you're being honest with the topic, how left-wing atheists are. It's common, of course, to rely heavily on the definition of the word atheism to prove the opposite. Just as atheism is defined as a lack of belief in a God, and therefore is a lack of belief in a God. And that means that, by definition, atheists never claim God does not exist. They merely lack belief in a God. Atheists make no claims, and thus atheists have no burden of proof, and besides, you can't prove a negative, even though, obviously, you can. The simple reality is, we have to accept that atheism is, by definition, a lack of belief in God. It is a psychological state. And contemplating what a lack of belief means, and what it means to exist in that psychological state, leads to various conclusions, like how atheism is not an ideology. And since atheism is not an ideology, not a belief, and definitely not a religion, atheists, by definition, are far more diverse in their thinking than religious people are. Religious people tend to be conservative, and that's because they follow holy books, and their holy books give them values that they cannot question or change because they see them as divine. And thus, that is why the overwhelming portion of religious people are conservative, because they follow holy books that do not change, and they hold to conservative values. On the other end, atheists are far more diverse. Because atheism is a mere lack of belief in a God and not an ideology, atheists can be right-wing or left-wing, it doesn't matter, and you'll find them roughly evenly distributed across the political spectrum, unlike religious people where, of course, some are left-wing, but that's because they're ignoring their scriptures. But most religious people are right-wing. The overwhelming majority of religious people are right-wing. The overwhelming majority of religious people are conservatives. We know this because, by definition, atheism is a lack of belief in a God, and therefore it must be politically diverse. And, of course, we know about the religious right. The problem is, this is a lie. When you're talking about religious people in the modern world, you're obviously excluding atheists because they have no religion. They merely lack belief in a God. Atheism isn't a religion. But at the same time, you will notice that the people who have nothing in common with each other but a lack of belief in a God will all say exactly the same things. And it's not just that they're arriving at the same conclusions based upon the same evidence. They will quote word for word the same things and use the same examples. For instance, when talking about the God that they don't believe doesn't exist but merely lack belief in, they will compare God to Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and Harry Potter. They will reference the flying spaghetti monster to show how ridiculous the concept of God is, even though they are not making any claims about God not existing. They merely lack belief in a God. They will inevitably bring up leprechauns and unicorns, and they will say word for word the same things about God, such as that he is a ruler of a celestial North Korea, that nothing fails like prayer, no hate like Christian love. And of course, since I've given more than 2 examples, I have just committed a logical fallacy, a dishonest tactic that we Christian apologists always do. And I am definitely a Christian apologist because I'm defending Christianity. And that makes me a liar for Jeebus, since apologetics is an inherently dishonest enterprise which starts at its conclusion and works backwards, unlike atheism, the mere lack of belief in a God, because atheists simply look at the evidence and follow it where it leads. Well, here's the problem. We know, if you look at Pew, for instance, that the overwhelming majority of people with no religion are left-wing, and this includes atheists. 69% of atheists in the United States who are registered to vote as Democrats. And of the remaining 31%, it isn't that the remaining 31% are Republicans. The majority of that 31% are actually independent and, looking at the data more thoroughly, left-wing. Only a tiny percent of them are Republicans. Meanwhile, religious people are actually more evenly diffuse. Granted, when most people talk about religious people, they mean Christians, but this Pew study does not limit it to Christians. So maybe Christians are overwhelmingly right-wing, and when they say religious people, they just mean Christians. The problem with this is that it's not true. In fact, a higher percent of people who identify as Christian vote Democrat. Even amongst the people we think of as right-wing, the evangelical Christians, the ones who are the most devout and most pious of Christians, who definitely believe in their faith more strongly and more thoroughly, according to the divine prophet Phil Zuckerman Most Holy, who bases this purely on the fact that they are more likely to be biblical literalists. After all, if you're a biblical literalist, you are pious. If you're a biblical literalist, you are devout. If you're a biblical literalist, you are the most committed form of Christianity, according to Phil Zuckerman. The problem is that even amongst evangelical Christians, there is more diversity in political thought than there is amongst people who merely lack belief in a God and have nothing in common with each other but their lack of belief in a God. Evangelical Christians are 56% Republicans, not 69% Democrat, as with the atheist community. Granted, 56% is still over half, and the majority of those left over are not Democrats. However, there is a higher percentage of evangelical Christians who are Democrat than there are atheists who are Republican. And therein lies the point. A good deal of how the modern atheist movement conceptualizes atheism is based purely on defining the word atheism as a lack of belief in a God, and pretending that the ramifications of this definition and the conclusions one would draw about atheism based upon this definition and how it should look in the real world is what is assumed to be true, even in the face of contradicting evidence. Atheism is, of course, not a lack of belief in a God. That definition of atheism was invented by Anthony Flew back in the 1970s in The Presumption of Atheism. While it is popular for modern-day atheists to claim that the definition of atheism has always been a lack of belief in a God, and to point to historical figures like Bertrand Russell and his teapots, and to claim that the entire point that Bertrand Russell was making is that should someone claim that there are teapots orbiting between Earth and Mars, then the burden of proof is on the one making the claim about the teapots, and not on those who doubt it, which by extension would also apply to God. If you claim God exists, the burden of proof is on you to prove God exists, not on the atheist. And of course, that isn't what Bertrand Russell was actually saying with his teapots. Bertrand Russell was actually saying belief that a teapot was orbiting between Earth and Mars is absurd on its face, and no one would believe it. But if a really old book said that there was a teapot between Earth and Mars, and our ancestors believed this book, and it had become ingrained in our culture that this book was correct, then it would seem insane to believe the sane proposition that there is no teapot. In reality, Bertrand Russell was claiming belief in God was stupid, obviously wrong, but that people don't see the obvious truth because they have been enculturated to believe that the Bible is the Word of God and tells us that God exists, and our culture is built upon God. His point was never that the burden of proof is on those making the claim and not on those who don't. And besides, the idea that atheists don't claim God doesn't exist is very obviously not true. The entire point of comparing God to Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, or to compare God to unicorns and leprechauns, or to compare God to Harry Potter, a fictional character, or to compare God to a flying spaghetti monster. All of those things are done specifically to claim God does not exist, because none of those things exist. That is the entire point of the argument. Ironically, atheists will often invoke them specifically whilst denying they're making any claims, and saying things like, I, as an atheist, I'm not claiming anything. You, the theist, are claiming your specific version of your God exists, and that it's not others like Zeus or Thor or Odin or Allah or Buddha. I don't have to prove anything, any more than I would have to prove Harry Potter doesn't exist. I don't have to prove God doesn't exist. And of course, that's bullying. The very moment you bring up Harry Potter and comparing God to Harry Potter, you are claiming God does not exist. So in the very statements that they are making, where they're denying that they're claiming God doesn't exist, while they're insisting that they merely lack belief in a God, have made no claims, and have no burden of proof, they are indeed claiming God does not exist. They want it both ways. They want to say God is no different than Harry Potter, a fictional character, whilst saying they aren't claiming that God does not exist, when they obviously are. And the same thing exists when they refer to God as a myth, or when they call God a fictional character, or when they call people delusional for believing in God. Do you know what the word delusional means? To be delusional, someone has to believe something even after being shown evidence that their belief is false. A delusion is a persistent belief in something that contradicts the facts that you know. In other words, if belief in a God is a delusion, that means the people who believe in God have been shown evidence that God does not exist, and are rejecting that evidence and persisting in their belief. Their belief would be irrational and unfounded, and would contradict the evidence, and that is what makes it delusional. And yet the atheists who freely call people delusional for believing in God also insist that they don't have to show any evidence that God does not exist. Well, how can someone be delusional for believing in God without being shown evidence that God does not exist? Atheists love word definitions until they are used against the atheist. They also refer to God as imaginary, and say things like God is just pretend. There's even a child's book written by the divine prophet Dan Barker, most holy. Hallowed be his name. God is just pretend. It's the name of the book. But if you're going to claim God is just pretend, you are making the claim that God does not exist, whether or not you admit that. When atheists say things like that, they're very obviously making a claim, and they very clearly have a burden of proof. They will often insult people by saying that God is their imaginary friend, and that an adult shouldn't have an imaginary friend, and they should have grown out of it. But how can you call God people's imaginary friend without saying God does not exist? If God is imaginary, then God only exists in the imagination, meaning that God doesn't actually exist. He's just a figment of people's imagination. People just create him in their heads. They even say that man creates gods. Well, how do you know that? What evidence do you have that God is just imaginary? Oh, I'm not allowed to ask for evidence. Atheism is, by definition, a lack of belief in a God. Nothing more. Atheists don't believe God doesn't exist. They lack belief. They never have the burden of proof. And this is actually the issue that I have, because the modern-day atheist movement is very clearly not rational, and it very clearly does not exist to evenly condemn all claims of gods and the supernatural. It very obviously focuses specifically on Christianity. Now, it is true that Islam is also frequently subject to the same hatred, but Islam is generally treated as this outsider religion, this other religion, whilst Christianity is our religion, and that even the atheists with no religion seem to treat Christianity as something that is theirs. Even people like Hemet Mehta, who was never a Christian, act as if Christianity is somehow his. Now, they like to claim that this is because Christianity is the most popular religion where they live, and if they were in the Middle East, they'd be criticizing Islam, but I highly doubt that. Their criticism of Christianity does not stem from the fact that they oppose all religions equally, and they simply focus on Christianity because it's the most popular religion. We've had years of the atheist movement now, and it's not just that the majority of time that they're talking about Christianity. It's that this is basically the only thing they ever criticize. Even when they criticize religion in general, it's very obvious that they're just criticizing Christianity. Like when they say theist or religious person, but then talk about believing in the Bible or believing Jesus is your savior, or even more abstract concepts such as religion says you can find salvation. But not all religions teach that you can find salvation. Not all religions are based on salvation. I know that the modern-day atheist movement commits a lot of equivocation fallacies, but it simply isn't true that salvation is something that is at the root of all the world's religions. And I'm not saying what I'm about to say because I'm a Christian and I think these other religions are false religions, therefore their claims of salvation are false. I'm saying they don't make claims of salvation. So if their religion is true, it would not actually mean that they offer you salvation. Judaism, for instance, does not offer salvation. It never did. Not in the sense that Christians mean with Jesus. It is true that Israel and the Jewish people will be saved by God, preserved, kept alive, but that's in this world, not a supernatural salvation going to heaven sort of thing. And while Islam has a concept of salvation, it is not central to it. Hinduism doesn't really have a concept of salvation. Neither does Buddhism or Taoism. This is not said to disparage any of these religions. It's simply a fact that they are not based upon the same thing Christianity is. And therein lies the point. It's obvious that the modern atheist movement is an anti-Christian movement more than it is an anti-religion movement. And it is equally obvious that the atheists who are critical of Christianity don't actually understand Christianity, and it wouldn't matter if they did. They are perfectly willing to lie about it. I know they're willing to lie because they will frequently say things they know aren't true. I know because I've caught them doing so several times. Such as, It's one thing, for instance, if you make a claim, such as a historical claim, that is not true and that you are misinformed. But if you're talking to me and I correct you, and you are a typical atheist and you ridicule me and you mock me and you demand I prove things even though you'll never have to prove anything, and I do, and you acknowledge that I'm right, and then a few months later you come back with the same false claim, you have to know that claim is false. We've been through it before. And I've seen them do that several times. They'll also lie about themselves. This is obvious, because if you haven't noticed, talking to atheists, they're a very dull lot, militant atheists. They always refer to the same handful of arguments, handful of Bible passages, and handful of topics. This is not because they're a diverse group of people who happen to be arriving at the same arguments. They're using exactly the same arguments, including the same terminology. So much so that it is frequently word for word the same, and even when it is not word for word identical, it's obvious that it is variations of the same quotes. They will also often try and drop shock value verses into conversations that they are in to make a point that doesn't actually exist, because they want to draw away from what's really being discussed. If you're debating them and they know they're losing, they'll drop a random verse in, and it's always the same ones, like Psalm 137:9 is popular. Happy shall he be that taketh thy little one and dashes his head against a stone. They want you to be shocked because they are convinced that Christians have never read their own Bible. They are unaware that this verse is there. Oh gosh! The Bible has this clear, unequivocal, evil verse that tells us to murder babies. Oh, how terrible! But the last time, at the time of this recording, I had an atheist drop Psalm 137:9 into the conversation. He did so when we were discussing modern political issues. It had absolutely nothing to do with the topic. So even if it's an inexcusably evil Bible verse that tells us to kill babies, it doesn't have anything to do with the topic. It's just there for shock value. And it doesn't shock me because even if they were right about me and I've never read my own Bible, I just listened to my preacher who indoctrinated me, and I only hear the cherry-picked nice parts. I've heard other atheists bring up Psalm 137:9. I know that it's evil, inexcusable verses in the Bible because atheists have rubbed my face in it over several years. And of course, I've actually defended Psalm 137:9 by explaining that it's not actually God telling people to kill babies, and I've been told that I prove that there's no hate like Christian love. Because if I tell them that that verse is not about killing babies, and is not an order to kill babies, that proves how hateful I am. Of course, Psalm 137 begins with a line, by the rivers of Babylon. And the reason it begins with those lines is because the psalm is about a man who was taken captive when Babylon conquered Judea. And he was taken to Babylon as a slave, and his new masters are telling him to sing a song from his homeland for their amusement, a happy song, a song of mirth. But he does not feel happy, he feels sorrow. And the psalm is a reflection of that sorrow. And when you get to Psalm 137:8, not 9:8, after lamenting his own fate as becoming a slave to Babylon, and after lamenting how Babylon is able to come in and conquer who they want, he then starts talking to Babylon, telling them that what they did to other people will one day occur to them. That even though they are a mighty empire today and they conquer others, one day they themselves will in turn be conquered. And that is when it leads to the infamous Psalm 137:9, which is often presented as a psalm of revenge, but it's not. There's no call for revenge here. Rather, as noted, Psalm 137:8 is telling Babylon that what they did to other people will be done to them. It isn't a Judean talking to other Judeans, calling them to revenge. It is a Judean telling the Babylonians that something will happen to them. the same thing that they did to others. Psalm 137:9 talks about taking children and dashing their heads against stones, because that is what the psalmist saw the Babylonians do to the children of Judea. And he is saying to the Babylonians, what you did to us will be done to you. Your children will be taken from you. Your children will have their heads smashed against stones. This is not a call for revenge, as even some modern Bible references say. And this is certainly not God himself commanding people to kill babies. This is telling the Babylonians that what they did to other people will be done to them. There's nothing evil in that. And yet, you see Psalm 137:9 used as an inexcusably evil Bible verse by people who also think that defining the word atheism as a lack of belief in a God means they never have to prove anything. Which also brings up the other problem with the atheist movement. While defining atheism as a lack of belief in a God leads them to say that they never have to prove God doesn't exist, the sole burden of proof is on the theist to show God does exist, the mentality this has created within the atheist movement is that they extend this no burden of proof concept to everything the atheist says. The atheist never has to prove anything. When an atheist makes a historical claim about how evil religion is, and you ask the atheist for evidence that this historical claim is true, well, that means you're making a claim that it's not true, and the burden of proof is on you to prove that it's not true. The burden of proof is not on the atheist to prove that it is true. We instead have to accept that what the atheist said about history is true. It is the default position in the argument that what the atheist says is true until it is proven false. If the atheist tells you that the Bible says something, you must accept that. The burden of proof is on you if you disagree. If the atheist claims that Christians have historically taught certain things, the burden of proof is on you to prove them wrong if you disagree, or even if you just ask for evidence. The atheist not only has no burden of proof to show that God doesn't exist, they have no burden of proof to show anything else. This has led, of course, to modern-day atheists being very lazy thinkers, even the ones who are in academia. And do keep in mind, academia in general has a host of problems today. A host of problems that I have been critical of in the past and will in the future in a dedicated video. But the atheist movement, while I don't think it is necessarily the origin of this, in fact I think it's the other way around, I think the academic standards declining are what prompted militant atheism to grow. If you actually looked at academic atheists, you'll see the same ridiculous ideas, such as the evil God challenge, produced by Stephen Law, a philosopher who actually works in a university teaching philosophy. He has a philosophy degree, and yet he doesn't understand the basic problem with the evil God theory. In fact, he doesn't even understand the argument made in reverse that he's trying to counter. The problem with the evil God challenge is that it ignores what God is. The same is true of basically all modern-day atheist arguments, even the ones we think of as brilliant. They seem to not grasp the very basic idea that God is the creator of everything else. We instead treat God as the shaper of the things in the universe, but not the creator of the universe. And keep in mind, right now I'm only talking about the way they approach God as a concept, not whether or not God actually exists, because even when dealing with fiction, which a lot of sociopathic atheists tend to call God, they call God a fictional character, we take it on its own terms. if I'm discussing Star Trek, I accept things on their own terms within Star Trek. I accept that Vulcans exist. I accept that Klingons exist. I accept that there are energy beings that feed off of emotion. I accept warp drive technology, the United Federation of Planets, that their version of the 23rd and 24th century, albeit sometimes contradictory even in the classical Trek, is based on humanist values. I accept all of that, even if I know it is fictional. Just as if I'm watching Star Wars, I accept the existence of the Jedi, I accept the existence of the Sith, I accept the existence of the Galactic Republic in the galaxy's history that was later turned into the Galactic Empire. I accept the Clone Wars and the droid armies and lightsabers and people being able to manipulate something called the Force. I accept all of that on its own terms. Whether or not an idea is internally consistent may not prove whether or not it exists, but at the same time, while God is ultimately more important than fiction, because people believe God exists, when dealing with the abstract, there really isn't much difference. You must accept God on his own terms, and while there are disagreements about the nature of God and theological questions, the one thing that within Christianity is universally agreed to, unless of course you include Mormons as Christians, which it is popular to do now, but problematic because they very obviously aren't Christians in the historical sense. And I'm not saying they're not Christians because I hate them and they disagree with me and they're a tribalist and yeah. I'm saying they are not Christian because they don't fit the historical definition of what a Christian is. I actually like Mormons. I have Mormon friends. I have Mormon family members. That's not really the problem. The problem is that they don't fit the historical, classical definition of what Christianity is. And I don't accept the idea that just anyone who calls himself a Christian is a Christian, because that's a stupid standard that atheists use to deliberately confuse the situation. And right now I am using the standards that historically have been used, notably things like the Nicene Creed, which, even if your church is not creedal and does not recognize the Nicene Creed, the question is not whether or not you actually accept the Nicene Creed, it is whether or not you accept the beliefs stated within the creed. That would be historical Christianity. And therein lies the point. The evil God challenge ignores the fact that God created the universe, and acts as if God is a being in the universe who at best created everything else in the universe, but more likely it treats God as something that arranged the things in the universe based upon them already existing in some form or some state. He rearranged matter and energy to create what we are, but he didn't create the matter and energy, he didn't create the universe. And the reason I say that is because the evil God challenge, and I'm simplifying just to explain my point, I'm not trying to steel man or straw man the argument, I'm simply trying to breeze through it to make a point. Stephen Law is critical of the people answering the problem of evil, the theodicy, with the claim that God gave us free will and must allow evil in order to allow us to have a free choice. And he's critical of it by asking, well, what if God is evil? What if God allows us to have free will so that we can choose to do evil? And that it's sometimes an unfortunate consequence that we choose good instead of evil. But God wants us to choose evil. And he's trying to use this to show how absurd it is to say that God gave us free will in order to give us a choice, and that it is unfortunate that we choose evil sometimes, but if we did not have the power to choose evil, then we really wouldn't have freedom of choice at all. And this is the explanation of evil. The problem with Stephen Law's argument is, he asks, how do you know God is not evil? This entire premise is predicated on the idea that what is good and what is evil are absolute standards outside of God to which we can judge God. Therein lies the problem, because there are no standards outside of God by which we can actually judge God. Because God is the creator of everything, God determined how everything is. God created good. And as much fun as atheists have quoting Isaiah 45:7 and saying, God created evil according to your Bible, they don't seem to understand that, for one, unless you're reading the authorized version, otherwise known as the King James Version, or one of its derivatives, like the American Standard Version, the text does not say God created evil. And I'm not just talking about modern Bible translations after atheists exposed the truth and Christians got all embarrassed and changed the Bible like translators always do because of how dishonest they are. I'm talking about Bible translations from before the authorized version, before the King James Version. Because they don't all say, God created evil. And the reason the authorized version does is because it's following the Vulgata, the Latin Vulgate. But it doesn't really matter, because while the authorized version was translated from the original Hebrew and for the New Testament Greek, it still did borrow heavily from Latinisms that people were used to in the church. And the term evil in the 1600s did not always refer to what we think of as evil. What we think of as evil is moral evil and actual malevolence and effort to do something bad to you. Evil in the 1600s could definitely be used to mean a moral evil, but it could also refer to natural calamities and disasters, such as hurricanes and earthquakes and rainstorms. That's not just regular rain, which in an agrarian society would be good, but torrents, flooding, and lightning, and terrible winds. Disaster. And we know that while the Wycliffe Bible also says God created evil, as does the Douay Rhymes, most Bible translations, even before the authorized version, such as the Coverdale Bible or the Bishop's Bible, simply don't use the word evil. And it's obvious if you read the text that it is talking about natural evils because, well, think about it. Here is the context. Starting at Isaiah 45, verse 5. I am the Lord, and there is none else. There is no God besides me. I girded thee, though thou hast not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none besides me. I am the Lord, and there is none else. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Drop down, ye heavens, from above, and let the skies pour down righteousness. Let the earth open, and let them bring forth salvation, and let righteousness spring up together. I, the Lord, have created it. Woe unto him that striveth with his Maker. Let the potsherds strive with the potsherds of the earth? Shall the clay say unto him that fashioned it, What makest thou? Or thy work? He hath no hands. Woe unto him that saith unto his father, What begettest thou? Or a woman, What hast thou brought forth? Thus saith the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, and his Maker, Ask me the things to come concerning my sons, and concerning the work of my hands command ye me. I have made the earth, and created man upon it. I, even my hands, have stretched out the heavens, and all the host I have commanded. Now, it's obvious that the point being made by these verses is that God created everything. So when it talks about God creating evil, is it really logical to assume that it's talking about moral evil, that God created malevolence? Or does it seem more like he's talking about those things in nature that cause problems, troubles, calamities, as it says in most translations? Since most don't use the word evil, they use the word trouble or calamity. Things along those lines. I read it very slowly, so you should have been able to follow it. But therein lies the point. Stephen Law's argument of evil God ignores that God created everything. There is no external standard of good and evil to which God is subject that we can apply to God. What is good was determined by God. What is evil is simply going against what was determined to be good by God. God cannot be evil simply because evil is working against the will of God. And by the way, if you're one of those sociopathic atheists who doesn't actually bother thinking, I'm not saying God sat behind a desk and wrote rules for us to follow, these moral rules, and gets to decide what rules. So telling me, oh, you're saying morals are arbitrary, so you're saying if God said murder was wrong tomorrow, it would be fine. What I'm saying is much more fundamental than that. I'm not simply talking about God setting up moral rules for us to follow. I'm talking about the very nature of our existence stemming from God. This is not about moral rules that we have to follow. This is about how the universe works. The universe itself is a reflection of God's will. The laws of nature that we have to obey as beings within the universe came from God. That's the point. And if you're one of those sociopathic atheists who says, well, you prove God exists, and prove it's your specific God and not, oh no, Buddha, keep in mind, I'm talking about Stephen Law's Evil God Challenge. And besides, none of you sociopathic atheists will ever show evidence that God does not exist, even though it's obvious you are making the claim that God doesn't exist, and it is obvious you have the burden of proof. But having said that, that's the main problem that the modern-day atheist community has. They don't understand the very idea of what God is supposed to be. They actually act as if the Evil God Challenge is rational and coherent when it simply isn't, because they see God as a being in the universe, subject to the laws of the universe, and there being an external standard of good and evil to which we can judge God based upon, and there is no external anything to God. There is no existence independent of God. That's the point of what God is. God is our creator. He isn't simply our creator in that he fashioned us out of pre-existing material. He created the materials that he fashioned us from. We would not exist if not for God creating us. That is why the evil God challenge does not make sense, because ultimately, prior to God creating anything, nothing existed, and there was no good, and thus no evil. Good is determined by living in accordance to certain natural laws and principles of the universe, and evil is an imbalance in that good and evil. It's rather like in Star Wars, where some people think balance to the Force means having equal light and equal darkness, when in reality, balance to the Force is not about equal light and equal darkness, it is about all light. And if it seems odd that all one and not the other is balance, keep in mind, the light side of the Force is not just a side of the Force as opposed to the dark side. Light, in the context of Star Wars, represents health and the way things should be. The light side of the Force is not really a side of the Force at all. It would be like if you're looking at a human body and that body is completely healthy. You do not think of that person as being out of balance and need to give him 50% illness and 50% injury. We do not think health is attained by having 50% health and 50% injury. We think proper health is having no injuries and no illness, and that is what balance would be to the Force. Balance would be no darkness or light, because light is health and vitality and what it should be. And that is the same principle with God, because ultimately the Force in Star Wars was created by George Lucas as an analog for God. It's what God was understood as by the people in the Star Wars galaxy. He said so himself in the interviews. It was about getting people to think about God and his nature, not so much in the sense of a specific religious tradition, but in the context of a broader theme. But then again, the modern-day atheist community seems to operate under the idea that each religion is distinct from all other religions, so that if one religion is true, then all other religions are simply false. So we only have three options. Either all religions are equally true, which is absurd since they contradict each other. There's one true religion and all other religions are false, or else no religion is true and the atheists are right. And this is actually a silly way of looking at it, because as a Christian, I don't think that my Christian religion is the one true religion, all other religions are fairy tales and wrong. Rather, I think all religions are philosophies. There's no difference between religion and philosophy. The modern distinction between religion and philosophy only goes back to the 1500s. Me saying that, by the way, if you're a sociopathic, morally degenerate atheist, is not me saying people didn't believe in gods prior to the 1500s. I'm rather tired of atheists thinking that's what I'm saying. It's obvious that I'm not saying that. But at the same time, if I tell them our concept of religion goes back only to the 1500s, and the ancient world had no concept of religion like we do, they think I'm saying, the ancient world is full of atheists. People did not believe in gods back then, because they're stupid. These are the same people who think I call atheism a religion. But then again, I guess it's my fault for being contradictory. It's sort of the problem I have with talking to atheists. It isn't so much whether or not they believed in God, it's whether or not they understood religion to be the belief in and worship of gods and supernatural powers like we do, and attributed to believing in and worship of gods and supernatural powers certain specific things like building temples and having sacrifices and such. To the people in the ancient world, worshipping a god and supernatural powers was not religion. It was just something they did. It was not distinct from philosophy. It was not distinct from politics. It was not distinct from their everyday life. The idea that there's this special thing called religion that is different from philosophy, different from science, different from politics, different from daily life, that is a thoroughly modern idea. That is an idea that did not exist in the Western world until the 1500s, and did not exist in the East until the 19th century, when the West was conquering the world in its colonial era and brought the idea to Asia. We have this artificial distinction between religion and everything else that simply did not exist historically. Incidentally, the concept of the supernatural also did not exist until the Middle Ages. and the ancient Greeks and Romans did not understand their gods as supernatural beings. Even though I'm going to be ridiculed for saying that, since by definition a god is a supernatural being. In the ancient world, people did not worship supernatural beings called gods. The gods were the personification of nature. The gods were themselves not the creators of nature. They were the products of nature and natural forces, and they themselves were natural forces. If you were to actually read Hesiod's Theogony, for instance, you do not see supernatural gods creating the universe. Rather, you see the universe coming into existence on its own, basically, and the gods coming from that creative process. The gods were the spirits that animated natural forces. The gods were those natural forces. The gods were not supernatural. And therein lies another point. Because the modern-day atheist movement does not try and understand ancient beliefs in the ancient world. They simply superimpose modern concepts of religion and philosophy onto an ancient world where they don't belong. They do the same thing with nation-states. To be fair, so do other people besides atheists. Learning history is one of those things that in our modern world we don't do very often. But the concept of the nation-state, while in the modern world is ubiquitous, did not actually exist in the ancient world. The Roman Empire was not a nation-state. Ancient Greece was not a nation-state. Ancient France and Germany and England, none of them were nation-states in the modern sense of the word. The idea of having a centralized governing authority that has jurisdiction over a specific geographical region, and that within the confines of that region, certain laws will determine the culture and ethics of the people there, is a thoroughly modern idea as well. It also emerged in the 1500s. Indeed, our idea of nationalism and our idea of religion are actually linked historically to certain developments occurring. But that's the point. The people in the ancient world would have had no idea what we were talking about if we talked about religion the way we do. And if you really stop and think about it, the modern people have gotten even less intelligent in how they talk about basically any topics, and the atheist community is amongst the least rational and least intelligent because they are certain of their own superiority. They are assured that they are more highly evolved and more rational than everyone else. And this superior rationality prevents them from actually being rational. Because they tell themselves they are the voice of reason, they do not subject their own claims to reason. Since they tell themselves that as atheists they're the ones championing critical thinking and must teach religious people how to use critical thinking, and are trying to elevate society by teaching critical thinking, it doesn't dawn on them that they are the ones that need to learn how to apply critical thinking, and that they need to apply it to the very things they're saying. In fact, defining atheism as a lack of belief in a god prevents them from applying critical thinking, precisely because they see atheism as a great big nothing burger. It's nothing. It's a lack of belief. There's nothing to subject to criticism. So that when they start talking about what atheists believe, or how atheists think, and how atheists are rational, and atheists use critical thinking, and atheists believe in science, they don't subject any of those claims to scrutiny. They do not apply critical thinking to the idea that an atheist embraces secular values, or what those secular values are, or where those secular values come from, or why they hold them. They don't have to, because atheism is a lack of belief in a god and has no values. So they want to believe both contradictory things without subjecting these things to any sort of critical analysis that would reveal that they can't both be true. Atheism can't just be a lack of belief in a god, nothing more, nothing less, whilst atheists are like-minded individuals sharing a similar value system. And yet they call themselves like-minded individuals. Atheism cannot be identified with reason if it is just a psychological state in which one lacks belief in a god. While one could be rational and lack belief in a god, there is no reason to link a lack of belief in a God to reason, and yet we see atheists do this all the time. The world's biggest atheist conference in Washington, D.C. was the Reason Rally, not the lack of belief rally, not the atheist rally, not the doubt rally, the Reason Rally. If you look at atheist websites for any length of time, it's obvious that reason and atheism are used synonymously. The divine prophet Sam Harris most holy proved that communism had nothing to do with atheism by saying they were not particularly rational. And therein lies the point. They will not subject their statement that atheism is a mere lack of belief in a God to critical thinking, because you cannot subject nothing to critical thinking, and atheism is nothing, while at the same time they associate certain beliefs and values and claims to atheism. They won't even apply critical thinking to the definition of atheism and ask if it applies to the real world in any meaningful way. We simply must accept the abstract claim that atheism is a lack of belief in a God, and from there not question anything we believe as atheists, because it's just a reflection of our lack of belief. There's nothing to question. And yet, there are things to question. For example, their mythology about religion being violent. Why should I believe that? I don't mean bring up the usual things like Crusades, Inquisition, witch hunts, 9/11, and of course other things that weren't actually done by religion, like the Wounded Knee Massacre, or fake things like mass graves in residential schools in Canada. I mean, ask yourself this. Why do I have to talk like a cartoon character when I bring up certain specific things? Why do I have to stammer? Well, it's because our gracious host does not like me saying certain things. Typically, the atheist community does not suffer the same issues that conservatives or Christians suffer on the two of you. And the reason for this is because Gaggle is actually run by people on the left who are more aligned with the atheist movement. A movement which, by the way, in its modern form, was financed by a certain man who had a certain island in islands that were named after the Blessed Mary, Mother of Jesus. I can't use his name, but his initials were J.E. By the way, look up the Edge Foundation. All four members of the Four Horsemen of the New Atheism had the same literary agent, John Brockman, who worked with the Edge Foundation, which itself was financed by J.E., who helped found the organization as it stood. So the modern New Atheist movement was created by someone who was interested in loving children, shall we say. Which is ironic, because that's what they accuse the Catholic Church of, and by extension all Christian churches. Because we never get into the loving of children by atheists, even though there were several that did, including Ray Moorhead, who was actually instrumental in creating things like the Reason Rally, and who was heavily active in the secularist movement, and who the secular movement protected when he got into a bit of trouble for loving children. Recovering from Religion and the Secular Student Alliance both defended him. Both of them, by the way, are 501c3 tax-exempt atheist organizations. They defend and protect Harry Hay, Samuel Delaney, the man who founded a certain love association for men and boys. Another name I can't really use, due to our gracious host, was an atheist in good standing with several atheist organizations. Incidentally, Madeleine Murray O'Hare was herself a communist who embraced Marxist ideologies. American Atheist was largely founded to promote Marxism. She equated atheism with Marxism and even attempted to defect to the Soviet Union. These, of course, are things you're not allowed to question. These are things you're not allowed to bring up. These are things you're not allowed to look at. Which brings us back to another point. The atheist movement always fails on self-criticism, and it doesn't really understand the arguments for the existence of God. If they did, you wouldn't see them claiming that the multiverse theory debunks the first cause argument, since, for one thing, even if it were true that if we live in a multiverse the first cause argument would be debunked, they can't actually prove we live in a multiverse. They just claim we do, and because it sounds more scientific to them and gives them an alternative to the first cause, then they use it as if it's a smoking gun when it simply isn't. The other problem, of course, is that they seem to think the first cause argument is only about this universe, and it says that God created this universe and this universe alone, so that if other universes exist, well, we don't need God to explain the existence of this specific universe, without bothering to actually realize they haven't explained where the multiverse comes from. And ultimately, the first cause argument is not about the creation of this universe, but not other universes in the multiverse. It is about the creation of everything. The word universe means everything. And what we call the multiverse would actually itself be the universe, and the universes in the multiverse would just be large something else's that are part of the universe. At least as far as the first cause argument is concerned. The first cause argument is not about the creation of this universe and this universe alone, not the other universes in the multiverse. It is about the creation of everything. Which is why it gets annoying when you see atheists say stupid things like, the first cause argument is special pleading. It isn't. Special pleading is when you make an unjustified exception for something, and the first cause argument doesn't even make an exception for God. The point of the first cause argument is that there must be an original cause that caused other things to go into motion. It is not saying that everything that exists needs a cause, which is the straw man version you hear atheists make. Then again, I've also heard others say, theists never explain why God is exempt from the first cause. Well, God isn't exempt from the first cause. God is the first cause. That's the point. Or they think that the argument is, the universe is so complex, it had to have a creator, but that creator would also have to be complex. Well, no. Traditionally, God is understood as simple, not complex, and complexity is not talking about mental complexity, although they like to pretend it is. It's talking about physical parts being involved, and God doesn't have physical parts. Again, this is why Mormons are not validly understood as Christian within the context of these debates. Because Mormons or Latter-day Saints may say that God does have a body of parts and passions and is just one God of many, which undermines trying to have a coherent view of what Christianity is if you try and shoehorn them in. Well, I don't have much else to say, so I am going to sign off. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.